They say one flap of a butterfly's wing on one side of the world can cause a hurricane on the other. Each of you, like the butterfly, in your own small way can improve this community, this country, even this world. And just like the butterfly, you might never realize it. You might help one family stop a pollution problem, or make it easy for an individual to enter some data onto the internet, or help a farmer make a dairy herd more profitable, or a community to be ready for disaster. And who knows what your small effort might lead to. Today, I want to introduce you to a lowly government employee, someone who still has an effect on my life, your life, and everyone here today. I'd like to introduce you to George Fred Brewster, my grand-uncle, my grandma's brother. He grew up very much like you and I. He was the fourth of 6 kids, born in 1910, grew up here in the Midwest in Wahpeton, North Dakota, just over the Minnesota border. And like you and me, he loved things, like Christmas. He loved to tease his older brother, Sylvester, by calling him Sally. He loved sports and was great at basketball. He enjoyed a trip down the Red River when the water was high. And fishing, well, let's just say he was pretty good, but he just couldn't remember the limits. He was an all-round fun guy. He went to the North Dakota State College of Science at Wahpeton, the University of Minnesota here in Minneapolis, Mayville Teachers College, and the University of North Dakota. He was a high school teacher and coach in North Dakota and in Graceville, Minnesota as well. In 1938, he became a weatherman, joining the U.S. Weather Bureau. Though science and weather was his passion, they ran a far second to flying. He became the Weather Bureau's first professional full-time pilot and convinced the Bureau that they needed an agency plane. He married, but whether the demands of the job kept him from home or dissatisfaction at home kept him at work, in either case, as what happens to many ordinary people, his marriage was short-lived. He threw himself into his job. He demonstrated the importance of flight to the Bureau, inspecting damages across the country like floods in Collier City, Florida, or hurricanes in Louisiana, studying the weather and the swallows of Capistrano, inspecting the damage of Easter tornadoes in Indiana, and blizzards out west. And that led to the thought, that led to the moment of inspiration, that led to the great change. When World War II broke out, Uncle George had a skill that few had. He understood the weather and flying, and he recognized a great weakness of the armed forces. It was impossible to predict the weather in the North Atlantic and Europe with the information the Allies had available. Without good forecasts, it was impossible to reliably plan maneuvers, flights, bombing runs, and ocean transport. He convinced the Weather Bureau to set up a series of weather stations in the Arctic Circle that would allow forecasts with greater accuracy than ever before known. Not only did he convince them that they needed it, but he was instrumental in their installation in their remote polar locations. The mission was long and difficult to the farthest points of dry land in North America. He traveled to Winnipeg in August, took the train to Churchill, and steamed out into Hudson Bay on the Nescopy northward toward the Arctic Ocean. He was to set up 2 weather stations, one at Arctic Bay and the second at Fort Ross. Nothing seemed to go right. He writes in his journal that the boxes are falling apart, lumber is scattered and loose on the ship deck, and the Army personnel are careless and rough with their fragile weather equipment, and things are just plain missing. A month later, They arrive in the far north, above the Arctic Circle at Arctic Bay, but winter had already set in. The ocean was already covered with ice 4 inches thick. The ship's captain refused to go on to the second weather station, so they just dropped the weather equipment and the supplies on the shoreline at Arctic Bay, and the Nescope turned tail back to Churchill to escape before the ice could entrap them for the season. In the Arctic Circle, there were no forklifts. There were no general contractors. It was just Uncle George and the native Eskimo people. Uncle George, the one that's 2 feet taller than all the rest of the men. Eventually, the weather station took shape. And eventually, the 2 main buildings were completed. And the work of the weatherman soon began. He arrived in September, and by November 10th, the weather station was 100% operational. However, he complained that some wise and helpful bureaucrat in Washington ordered a wood-burning stove for heat. Apparently, they did not quite understand what it was like above the Arctic Circle. Despite the desolate location, the information gathered was invaluable to the war campaigns, to D-Day, and the ultimate victory in Europe. After the war, George was promoted to chief pilot of the Weather Bureau in 1958 and was assigned to Washington, D.C. The Bureau traded in the aging single-engine plane for a 2-engine Beechcraft with increased range and speed. Even though he was the chief of all pilots, he did not fly a desk. He continued to fly scientists wherever and whenever they needed. On July 25th of 1960, he was transporting 6 other weathermen and pilots to the Nome, Alaska station, leaving Anchorage at 9 o'clock. He reported in at 10:15 as they approached the Alaskan Range through central Alaska. They were never seen again. 3 years later, a bush pilot spotted the wreckage on the mountain slopes near Rainy Pass in the Alaskan Range. George Brewster did not discover the cure for polio. He did not lead the invasion at Normandy. He did not serve in Congress. He was simply a weatherman working for the government, and he did his job the best he could, helping others by using the talents he had. Even today, you are the beneficiaries of his efforts. For every forecast warning you of an Arctic clipper, or a blizzard, or a nor'eastern storm, the information was probably gathered from one of his stations in the Arctic Circle. You too have not discovered the cure for AIDS. You're not heroes of the Iraqi war, and you have not served in Congress. But I challenge you to use your talents, your skills, your knowledge, your position as a lowly government worker, just as my Uncle George did, to help others, to improve our communities, our country, and perhaps, like that butterfly, you might just create a whirlwind on the far side of the world.